The clanking of iron chains against the wooden floorboards of Circleville's only general store silenced every conversation as Primrose Wade stumbled through the doorway, her wrists and ankles bound in heavy shackles. Dust-coated and exhausted, she lifted her gaze to meet the stunned expressions of the townsfolk gathered inside, her green eyes burning with a mixture of defiance and humiliation that belied her dire circumstances. "Here she is, Xander," announced the burly man who prodded her forward with the barrel of his rifle. "Your mail-order bride, just like you ordered, though I reckon you didn't expect her delivered like this." Xander Zane stood frozen behind the counter, his hat in his hands and disbelief etched across his sun-weathered face. The year was 1878, and while he had indeed sent away for a bride from back east, nothing could have prepared him for this moment. He moved with purpose around the counter, his tall frame casting a shadow as he approached, blue eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his Stetson. "What in God's name is the meaning of this, Thornton?" Xander demanded, his voice low but carrying the weight of thunder. Thornton Jenkins, a transport agent known throughout Utah Territory for his unscrupulous methods, merely shrugged. "She tried to flee in Denver. Terms of her contract say she owes passage and a fine for attempting to break agreement. These," he rattled the chain connecting her wrists, "ensure delivery as promised." Primrose flinched at the harsh sound but kept her chin raised. "There was no contract. Only lies and threats," she said, her Eastern accent making her words sound even more out of place in the frontier store. Xander's eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared indignation. Without breaking that gaze, he reached for the hunting knife sheathed at his belt. In one fluid motion that spoke of years handling cattle and breaking horses, he stepped forward. "Stand back," he commanded Thornton, who hesitated but complied when he noted the steel in Xander's eyes. With precision born of a life working the land, Xander knelt before Primrose. The sharp blade of his knife found the lock of her ankle shackles, and with a few calculated movements, the mechanism gave way. The chains fell to the wooden floor with a heavy thud that echoed through the now silent store. Xander worked methodically on her wrist bindings next, every face in the establishment watching with bated breath. When the second set of chains clattered to the ground, he stood straight, returned his knife to its sheath, and spoke words that would forever alter both their lives. "You're free now," he said simply, his voice carrying no room for argument. Primrose rubbed her raw wrists, disbelief washing over her features. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. "I mean exactly what I said. You're not bound to any contract you didn't willingly sign. You're not property to be delivered. You're free to stay or go as you choose." Thornton stepped forward, his face reddening. "Now see here, Zane. I've traveled near 3 weeks with this woman. I'm owed." Xander turned slowly to face the man, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "You'll be owed 6 feet of Circleville soil if you don't back away right now." The store fell so silent that the ticking of the wall clock seemed to pound like a war drum. Thornton, reading the situation correctly for perhaps the first time in his miserable life, took a step backward. "Sheriff Patterson might have something to say about this," Thornton threatened weakly. "I imagine he will," came a new voice from the doorway. Sheriff Daniel Patterson stood there, thumbs hooked in his belt. "And it'll start with asking why you're trafficking women in chains through my town." Primrose's legs, weak from days of restricted movement, nearly gave out beneath her. Xander's arm shot out to steady her, and the brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her chilled body. "Madam," the sheriff continued, addressing her directly, "would you care to tell me your side of this story?" Every eye in the general store fixed on her face. Primrose Wade, who had left Philadelphia with dreams of a new beginning, found herself at a crossroads she'd never imagined. The man who had sent for her as a bride had just declared her free. The chains lay at her feet, and for the first time in weeks, choice belonged to her. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Primrose Wade." I was a governess in Philadelphia until 3 months ago when the family I served moved to Europe. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly in the hushed store. With few prospects remaining, I answered an advertisement for brides seeking husbands in the West. The agent, Mr. Hargrove, showed me letters and a daguerreotype. Her eyes flickered briefly to Xander. I was told I would be traveling to meet a rancher named Xander Zane who sought a wife to help establish his homestead. Sheriff Patterson nodded. And how did you end up in chains, Miss Wade? Primrose's fingers unconsciously traced the raw marks on her wrists. The journey began normally enough. I traveled by train to St. Louis with several other women answering similar advertisements. In St. Louis, we were transferred to Mr. Thornton's care for the remainder of the journey. That's when everything changed. Her voice wavered slightly. He informed us that we had each incurred substantial debts for our transport that would need to be repaid to our future husbands through labor or other means. Her cheeks flushed at the implication. When I protested and attempted to withdraw from the arrangement during our stop in Denver, he claimed I had violated my contract and placed me in these restraints as punishment. Thornton started to object, but Sheriff Patterson silenced him with a raised hand. The other women. The sheriff pressed, delivered to towns along the way, some resigned to their fate, others. She closed her eyes briefly. Others were like me, but without someone willing to cut their chains. Xander, who had remained silent throughout her account, finally spoke. Sheriff, this man has no authority to enforce any such contract, even if one existed. Miss Wade came in response to my advertisement, yes, but as a free woman making her own choice. That's right, confirmed Walter Graham, the storekeeper. I remember you placing that ad, Zane. Paid good money for it, too. Sheriff Patterson nodded slowly. Thornton, you're under arrest for kidnapping and extortion. We'll sort out the rest after I send telegrams to Denver and the other stops you made. He motioned to his deputy, who had appeared in the doorway. Take him to the jail. As Thornton was led away, protesting loudly, the storekeeper's wife, Martha, bustled forward. You poor dear, she said to Primrose. You must be exhausted. Come along to the back room and I'll fetch you some water to wash up. Primrose hesitated, glancing at Xander. Despite his declaration of her freedom, she had traveled all this way to be his bride. What was expected of her now, sensing her uncertainty, Xander stepped forward. Miss Wade, you've had a harrowing journey and deserve rest. The Grahams run a clean establishment and Mrs. Graham is as kind a soul as you'll find in Utah territory. I'd be honored if you'd accept their hospitality until you decide what you wish to do next. What I wish to do next, Primrose repeated, still struggling to comprehend her sudden liberty. Yes, Xander confirmed, his voice gentle but firm. The choice is entirely yours. If you wish to return east, I will personally arrange and pay for your safe passage. If you wish to stay in Circleville, I'm certain work can be found suited to your skills. And if, he paused, suddenly appearing less certain of himself, if you still wish to consider the arrangement that brought you here, then we can discuss that too, but only when you're rested and have had time to consider your options freely. The gathered townsfolk murmured their approval. Primrose felt tears threatening to spill from her eyes, not from fear or exhaustion this time, but from the unexpected kindness being shown to her. Thank you, she managed. I would appreciate some time to consider, Mrs. Graham led her gently toward the back room, while the sheriff pulled Xander aside for further questioning about the mail-order bride scheme. As she disappeared through the doorway, Primrose caught one last glimpse of the tall cowboy, his brow furrowed in concern as he answered the sheriff's inquiries. The chains that had bound her lay discarded on the floor, a physical reminder of constraints now broken. In the small but tidy back room of the general store, Martha Graham helped Primrose wash the dust of travel from her face and hands. The older woman clucked sympathetically at the raw marks left by the shackles. That man ought to be horsewhipped, Martha declared, gently applying a soothing salve to Primrose's wrists. Treating a lady like common cargo, Primrose winced slightly at the sting of the medicine. I still can hardly believe what Mr. Zane did. He paid for a bride but freed me instead." Martha smiled knowingly as she wrapped clean cloth around Primrose's wrists. "That's Xander for you. He's got a strong sense of right and wrong, that one. Been that way since he was a boy." "You've known him long?" Primrose asked, curiosity piqued. "Oh, since he first came to Circleville about 8 years back. Just 20 then, looking older with that serious face of his. Worked for old man Burris until he saved enough to buy his own place." She paused her ministrations to look Primrose in the eye. "He's a good man, Miss Wade." "One of the best in these parts," Primrose nodded, uncertain how to respond. The man who had cut her chains was still essentially a stranger to her. "There now," Martha said, finishing her bandaging. "I've laid out some fresh clothes that my niece left behind last visit. They might be a bit large, but they'll do until we can see to your things." "My belongings?" Primrose asked, suddenly remembering her trunk. "I had a trunk when I left Philadelphia. Don't you worry. Walter's gone to fetch it from that scoundrel's wagon before the sheriff takes it as evidence. You rest now. I'll bring you some hot stew shortly." Left alone, Primrose changed gratefully into the borrowed dress. It hung loose on her frame, evidence of the weight she'd lost during the difficult journey west. As she sat on the small cot in the corner of the room, the reality of her situation finally began to sink in. She was free, yes, but also alone in a frontier town thousands of miles from everything familiar. She had little money of her own, having spent most of her savings on the initial travel arrangements. What would she do now? Return east to what? The life of a governess had been respectable but lonely, and positions were scarce. Stay here? She knew no one. Consider still becoming Xander Zane's wife. The thought brought a flush to her cheeks. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Miss Wade, it's Xander Zane. I've brought your trunk. Please come in," she called, hastily smoothing the borrowed dress. The door opened, and Xander entered, carrying her weathered trunk with apparent ease. He set it down carefully at the foot of the cot, then straightened, removing his hat as he did so. Without the shadow of his hat brim, she could see his features clearly for the first time. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with eyes the color of the summer sky and hair the rich brown of fertile soil. His face was indeed weathered by sun and wind, but handsome in a rugged way that spoke of hard work rather than hard living. "I hope I'm not disturbing your rest," he said, his deep voice softer than it had been in the confrontation with Thornton. "Not at all," she assured him. "I was just thinking," he nodded, understanding without her having to elaborate. "Sheriff Patterson would like to speak with you tomorrow if you're feeling up to it. He's sending telegrams to track down the other women who traveled with you." "Of course. I'll help however I can." An awkward silence fell between them. Xander shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hat in his hands. "Miss Wade, I want to apologize," he finally said. Her brows drew together in confusion. "For what, Mr. Zane? You saved me from a terrible situation. But it was my advertisement that led you into it." "I never imagined." He trailed off, shaking his head. "When I wrote Seeking a Wife, I had no idea such men would use it as an opportunity to exploit women. The fault lies with Mr. Thornton and his associates, not with you," Primrose said firmly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing beyond the exhausted, trail-worn woman before him to something else. "You're very kind, Miss Wade," she smiled faintly. "As are you, Mr. Zane. Not every man would have cut those chains." "Any decent man would have," he insisted, though they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. Another silence fell, more comfortable this time. "Mrs. Graham says you have a ranch," Primrose ventured, curious to know more about the man she had traveled so far to marry. Xander nodded, a flash of pride crossing his features. "About 5 miles outside of town. Nothing grand, but it's mine. 160 acres under the Homestead Act. I've got a decent herd of cattle started and some good horses. And you work it alone." "I've got a hand who helps with the cattle, Pablo Vasquez. Good man, been with me 3 years now, and his wife Maria helps with the cooking when I'm busy with the herd." He hesitated before adding, "The house is new, built it myself over the last year. 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, even glass windows ordered from Salt Lake City." Primrose realized he was describing what would have been her home had things gone according to the original plan. The thought stirred something unexpected within her. "It sounds lovely," she said softly. "It's not Philadelphia," he acknowledged, a hint of self-deprecation in his tone. "Philadelphia wasn't always kind to me," she admitted. "I've dreamed of open spaces and a home of my own for longer than I can remember." Something shifted in Xander's expression, hope, perhaps, or understanding. Miss Wade, a knock interrupted him as Martha Graham returned with a tray of food. "Here we are, hot stew and fresh bread. Oh, Xander, good, you've brought her trunk. Now don't you go tiring her out with talk. This poor girl needs rest." Xander replaced his hat, tipping it slightly. "Of course, Mrs. Graham. Miss Wade, I'll call on you tomorrow if that's agreeable." "I would like that," Primrose replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. With a nod, he departed, leaving Primrose with her thoughts, a hot meal, and the first fragile seeds of possibility taking root in her heart. The next morning dawned clear and bright over Circleville. Primrose woke early, having slept better than she had in weeks despite the narrow cot and unfamiliar surroundings. The weight of the chains, both literal and figurative, was gone, and with it, some of the exhaustion that had plagued her journey. She dressed in her own clothes, gratefully retrieved from her trunk, and arranged her hair as best she could without her usual toiletries. The woman who looked back at her from the small mirror on the wall was thinner and paler than the one who had left Philadelphia, but her eyes held a spark that had been missing for some time. A soft knock at the door preceded Martha Graham's cheerful voice. "Miss Wade, are you decent?" "I've brought breakfast. Please come in," Primrose called, smoothing her skirts one last time. Martha entered with a tray laden with food, eggs, bacon, biscuits, and coffee that smelled heavenly after weeks of trail rations. "My goodness, don't you clean up nicely?" "Feeling better this morning, dear?" "Much better, thank you. Your kindness has been overwhelming." "Nonsense," Martha waved away the gratitude. "Any decent person would do the same. Now eat up." "Sheriff Patterson will be by at 9 to take your statement, and then I thought you might like a proper tour of our little town." Primrose smiled at the older woman's enthusiasm. "That sounds wonderful." As she ate, Martha chattered happily about Circleville, its founding after the Black Hawk War, the families who lived there, the church that served as the center of community life, and the prospects for growth with the railroad survey teams that had passed through recently. "Of course, we're nothing like Philadelphia," Martha acknowledged, "but there's a good life to be had here for those willing to work for it." "I'm not afraid of work," Primrose assured her. "In fact, I should start looking for employment immediately. I can't impose on your hospitality indefinitely." Martha's eyes twinkled. "Well, as it happens, our schoolteacher, Miss Abernathy, is expecting her first child and is looking for someone to take over her duties come fall. With your experience as a governess, you might be just the person." Hope flickered in Primrose's chest. Teaching had always been her passion, even more than the child-minding duties of a governess. "Do you really think she would consider me?" "I don't see why not. I'll introduce you later today." Their conversation was interrupted by Walter Graham calling from the store. "Martha." "Sheriff's here for Miss Wade." Sheriff Patterson was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and kind eyes that belied the stern set of his mouth. He removed his hat as Primrose entered the store's front room, treating her with a deference that helped ease her nervousness. "Miss Wade, I hope you're feeling recovered this morning," he said. "Yes, thank you, Sheriff. The Grahams have been most kind." "Good folks, the Grahams." He gestured to a chair beside the store's pot-bellied stove. "If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you some questions about your journey and the other women who traveled with you." For the next hour, Primrose recounted everything she could remember: names, descriptions, destinations mentioned, the specifics of Thornton's operation. The sheriff took careful notes, his expression darkening as the full extent of the scheme became clear. Sounds like Thornton was working with this Hargrove fellow back east to deceive women and extort money from the men who sent for brides, he concluded grimly. I've already had responses to 2 of my telegrams, similar stories in Carson City and Laramie. Will the other women be helped? Primrose asked anxiously. I'm coordinating with the other sheriffs. Those we can locate will be offered assistance. He closed his notebook with a snap. Your testimony will be valuable in bringing these men to justice, Miss Wade. I'm happy to help however I can. The sheriff nodded approvingly. You've shown remarkable courage, madam. Not everyone would have stood their ground as you did. Primrose felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. I simply couldn't accept being treated as property. And rightly so. Sheriff Patterson replaced his hat. Now, I understand Zane has offered to arrange your return east if that's your wish. He has, yes. He's a good man, Xander, one of the best in the territory. It was the second time in as many days Primrose had heard this assessment. Whatever you decide, you'll have the support of decent folks here in Circleville. After the sheriff departed, Martha made good on her promise of a tour. Circleville was indeed small compared to Philadelphia, just a few dozen buildings arranged around a central square, with the church at one end and the sheriff's office at the other. But there was a vitality to the place that appealed to Primrose. People greeted each other by name, stopped to chat, offered warm welcomes to her as a newcomer. At the small schoolhouse on the edge of town, they met Eliza Abernathy, a young woman with a gentle manner and obvious intelligence who was visibly relieved at the prospect of a qualified replacement. The children deserve someone who can keep up with them, she explained, resting a hand on her growing belly. And frankly, Miss Wade, I'm eager to focus on preparing for this little one. I understand completely, Primrose assured her. If the school board approves, I would be honored to take over your duties. I'll speak to them immediately, Eliza promised. Term starts in 3 weeks, which should give us time to make the transition smoothly. As they left the schoolhouse, Primrose felt a surge of excitement. A teaching position would provide her with income, purpose, and a place in the community. It wasn't what she had expected when she'd left Philadelphia, but perhaps it was exactly what she needed. They were crossing back through the town square when Martha suddenly brightened. Oh, look. Here comes Xander. Primrose turned to see him riding toward them on a magnificent chestnut horse. He sat tall in the saddle, at ease in a way that spoke of years spent on horseback. Seeing them, he guided his mount over and dismounted in one fluid motion. Mrs. Graham, Miss Wade, he greeted them, once again removing his hat. I hope I find you both well, splendid Xander, Martha replied cheerfully. I've been showing Miss Wade around our little town, and we've just come from the schoolhouse where it seems she may have secured employment for the fall term. Surprise and something like pleasure flickered across Xander's face. Is that so? Congratulations, Miss Wade. It's not certain yet, Primrose demurred. The school board must approve. They'd be fools not to, he said with such conviction that Primrose felt warmth spreading through her chest. You have experience teaching? I was a governess to 3 children in Philadelphia. Before that, I assisted at a girls' academy. Then Circleville's children will be fortunate indeed. He hesitated before continuing. I was hoping, Miss Wade, that you might allow me to escort you to dinner this evening. The hotel serves a decent meal, and I thought. Well, we might become better acquainted. Martha beamed at the invitation while trying to appear as though she wasn't listening intently. Primrose found herself momentarily speechless. Despite the circumstances that had brought her to Utah, she had traveled there with the expectation of becoming this man's wife. Now, free from obligation, she was being courted properly as any lady might wish to be. I would be delighted, Mr. Zane, she finally replied. Excellent. Shall I call for you at the Grahams at 6? 6 would be perfect. He smiled then, a full, genuine smile that transformed his serious face and made him appear years younger. Until then, Miss Wade. As he rode off, Martha couldn't contain herself any longer. Well, isn't that lovely? We must make sure you look your absolute best. I have just the thing, a lovely blue ribbon that will complement your eyes beautifully. Primrose barely heard her, watching Xander's retreating figure with a strange fluttering in her stomach that had nothing to do with nervousness and everything to do with anticipation. By 6 o'clock, Primrose was ready, wearing her best dress, thankfully not too crushed from its journey, in her trunk, with her hair arranged in a simple but elegant style and Martha's blue ribbon woven through it. She waited in the Graham's small parlor, trying to calm the racing of her heart. "You look beautiful, dear," Martha assured her for the third time. "Like a proper lady." "Thank you," Primrose replied, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt. "I confess I'm rather nervous." "That's natural. But remember, Xander's probably just as nervous. Men don't show it the same way, but they feel it all the same." The thought of the confident cowboy being anxious about their dinner made Primrose smile. Before she could respond, however, there was a knock at the door. Walter went to answer it, and moments later, Xander stepped into the parlor. He had clearly made an effort for the evening. His clothes were clean and pressed, his hair neatly combed, and he carried a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Miss Wade," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual, "you look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Zane, as do you." She accepted the flowers with a smile. "These are beautiful. Nothing special, just some Indian paintbrush and lupine from near the creek, but I thought you might like them." "I do, very much." Martha bustled forward to take the flowers. "I'll put these in water for you, dear." "Now off you go, you two. Enjoy your evening." The walk to Circleville's small hotel took only minutes, but it gave Primrose a chance to observe Xander in a different light. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, yet there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested Martha might be right about his nervousness. "I hope you don't find our town too provincial after Philadelphia," he said as they walked. "Not at all," she assured him. "It has a charm all its own. Everyone has been so welcoming. People look out for each other here. It's one of the things I love about it." "How did you come to settle in Circleville?" she asked, genuinely curious about the man who might have been her husband and who might yet become. "Something else." Xander's expression turned reflective. "I grew up in Missouri, St. Joseph. My father had a small farm, but it wasn't enough to support all of us after he passed. I was the oldest of 5, so at 18 I headed west to find my fortune. Did you find it?" He chuckled, the sound warm in the cool evening air. "Not in the way I expected. Tried mining for a while in Colorado, nearly died of pneumonia my first winter. Then I drove cattle up from Texas for a few seasons. Hard work, but I learned a lot. Finally made my way to Utah Territory in '70 and knew I'd found where I belonged." "It must have been difficult starting over on your own." "It was," he acknowledged. "Still is sometimes. Ranching isn't an easy life, especially alone." The implication hung in the air between them as they reached the hotel. Xander held the door for her, and they entered the small dining room where several other couples and families were already enjoying their meals. The hotel owner, a rotund man named Joseph Parsons, greeted them warmly and showed them to a table by the window. "Best spot in the house for you and your lady friend, Xander," he said with a wink that made Primrose blush. Once seated, an initial awkwardness fell between them. This was, Primrose realized, essentially their first meeting. The encounter in the general store hardly counted. Yet here they were, dining together as if courting, when under different circumstances they might already be living as husband and wife. "May I ask you something, Mr. Zane?" She finally said, "Of course, and please call me Xander." "Xander, then." The name felt intimate on her lips. "Why did you advertise for a bride? Surely there are eligible women in Utah Territory." He considered the question thoughtfully, taking a sip of water before answering. "There are some, yes, though fewer than you might think in these parts, but the truth is I'm not very good at this." He gestured between them. "Courtship, I mean. I can break a wild horse and track a steer for miles, but talking to ladies, I never learned that skill." His honesty touched her. "And yet here you are, doing admirably." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Because you make it easy, Miss Wade." "Primrose," she corrected gently. "If I'm to call you Xander, you must call me Primrose." "Primrose," he repeated, as if testing the name. "It suits you, delicate but resilient, one of the first flowers to bloom after winter's hardship." She hadn't expected poetry from the plain-spoken cowboy, and the surprise must have shown on her face. "I do read, you know," he said with a hint of amusement. "Not much else to do during the long winter evenings." "I didn't mean to suggest. I'm teasing you, Primrose." His use of her name sent a pleasant shiver through her. "I know I'm not what most Eastern ladies would consider a suitable match. I'm rough around the edges, with calloused hands and limited formal education." "And yet you freed a woman who was brought to you in chains," she countered. "That speaks more of your character than any polish or education ever could." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their food's simple fare of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread, but well prepared and plentiful. As they ate, they continued to learn about each other. Primrose told him about growing up as the daughter of a minister who valued education for his daughters as well as his sons, about losing both parents to influenza when she was 19, about supporting herself as a teacher and then a governess. "It wasn't a bad life," she concluded, "but it wasn't mine either. I was always living in someone else's home, subject to someone else's rules." "Is that why you answered my advertisement?" Xander asked. "To have a home of your own, partly," she admitted, "but also for the adventure, I think. To see what lies beyond the world I've always known. And now that you've seen Circleville." There was vulnerability in the question, a need to know if she found his world wanting. Primrose considered her answer carefully. I think I'd like to see more of it. Especially if the teaching position becomes available." Relief washed over his features. "You'll stay then?" "For now, yes. Beyond that." She met his gaze directly. "I suppose that depends on many things." The look they shared held promise not of immediate romance, but of possibility of paths that might converge if they both chose to walk them. As they finished their meal, Xander grew quiet, seemingly lost in thought. Finally, he spoke again. "There's something I'd like to show you if you're willing. It's not far, but we'd need to ride." Curiosity piqued, Primrose nodded. "I'd like that. Tomorrow, then, I could come for you mid-morning." "Tomorrow," she agreed. The walk back to the Grahams was companionable, their initial awkwardness replaced by a growing ease in each other's presence. At the door, Xander took her hand gently in his, mindful of her still healing wrists. "Thank you for a lovely evening, Primrose." "Thank you for inviting me, Xander." He hesitated, then raised her hand and pressed his lips to it, briefly, a gesture both old-fashioned and thrilling. "Until tomorrow." As she watched him walk away, Primrose touched the spot where his lips had brushed her skin, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The chains that had brought her to Circleville were gone, but new ties were forming, ties of friendship, respect, and perhaps, in time, something deeper. True to his word, Xander arrived the next morning leading 2 horses, his chestnut gelding and a gentle-looking gray mare. Primrose, who had risen early in anticipation, was ready in a practical riding outfit that Martha had helped her alter from one of her day dresses. "Have you ridden before?" Xander asked as he helped her mount. "Some, though not extensively," she admitted, adjusting her skirts over the side saddle. "My father believed all ladies should know the basics. Daisy here will take good care of you," he assured her, patting the mare's neck. "She's steady as they come." They set off at an easy pace, Xander guiding them out of town and onto a dirt road that wound through sage-covered hills. The day was perfect for riding clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the kind of expansive beauty that Philadelphia, for all its charms, could never offer. "It's breathtaking," Primrose said, taking in the vista of mountains in the distance and the wide valley below. "Wait until you see where we're going," Xander replied with a hint of pride. They rode for about an hour, climbing gradually higher until they crested a rise, and Xander reined his horse to a stop. "There," he said simply, gesturing ahead. Below them lay a verdant valley cradled between hills, with a creek winding through its center like a silver ribbon. Near the creek stood a modest but well-built house with a barn and corral nearby. A small herd of cattle grazed in the distance, and closer to the house was a fenced garden patch. "Your ranch?" Primrose asked, though she already knew the answer. "Zane's Crossing," he confirmed. "Named for the creek crossing there, it's not much compared to the big spreads further north, but it's beautiful," she interrupted sincerely. He looked pleased at her assessment. "Would you like to see the house?" They continued down the slope, and as they drew nearer, Primrose could appreciate the care that had gone into establishing the homestead. Everything was neat and purposeful, from the well-constructed fences to the straight rows of the garden. The house itself was painted white with green trim, its windows gleaming in the morning sun. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, dark-haired and shorter than Xander but strongly built. He waved when he spotted them. "That's Pablo," Xander explained. "He and Maria have been with me since I first claimed the land. I don't know what I'd have done without them." Pablo greeted them warmly, his English accented but clear. After brief introductions, he offered to stable their horses while Xander showed Primrose the house. "Maria's in town today visiting her sister," Xander said as he opened the front door, "but she made sure everything was in order before she left." The interior of the house was as well tended as its exterior, simple but comfortable furnishings. Clean swept floors and curtains at the promised glass windows. It was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a spacious main room combining kitchen and living areas, and doors leading off to what Primrose assumed were the bedrooms. "You built this yourself?" she asked, running her hand along the smooth wood of a handcrafted table. "With help," he acknowledged. "Pablo's a better carpenter than I am, and I traded cattle for some of the finer work like the cabinetry. It's lovely, a real home." Something flickered in Xander's eyes, longing, perhaps. That was the idea, not just shelter but somewhere. He trailed off, seeming embarrassed. "Somewhere to put down roots," Primrose finished for him. "Yes," he cleared his throat. "Would you like to see the garden? Maria's quite proud of it." Outside, the garden plot revealed neat rows of vegetables, corn, beans, squash, and tomatoes, along with herb beds, and even a few flowers adding spots of color. Beyond it lay an orchard of young fruit trees, still small but clearly thriving. "In a few years, those trees will bear proper crops," Xander explained. "Apples, peaches, and plums. I'm experimenting with cherries too, though they're more temperamental." "You're planning for the long term," Primrose observed. "That's the only way to build something worthwhile." He looked at her then, his expression earnest. "Primrose, I didn't bring you out here just to show off my ranch." "I know," she said softly. He took a deep breath. "When I sent for a bride, I did it because I was ready to share this life with someone. To build something together that neither of us could create alone. What happened with Thornton was, well, it wasn't what either of us expected, but I'd like to think maybe it happened for a reason." "What reason would that be?" "If you'd arrived as originally planned, not in chains, of course, but bound by a contract and obligation, would you have felt truly free to choose this life? To choose?" He hesitated. "To choose me?" The question hung in the air between them, weighty with implication. "No," Primrose admitted after a moment. "I would have felt obligated to honor the arrangement, regardless of my true feelings." Xander nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he had suspected. "I don't want a wife who feels obligated. I want a partner who chooses this life, who chooses me freely." Primrose's heart quickened at his words. "Are you proposing to me, Xander Zane?" "Not yet," he said with unexpected candor. "I respect you too much to rush that decision. What I'm proposing is time for you to see if Circleville could be your home, if teaching could be your calling, and if I—" He swallowed visibly. "If I could be someone you might choose when you're ready to make that choice." It was perhaps the most honest courtship offer Primrose had ever heard. No pretty words or empty promises, just a straightforward invitation to discover what might be possible between them. It touched her deeply. "I accept your proposal of time," she said, smiling at the relief that washed over his features. "And I look forward to discovering the answers to those questions together." As summer faded into fall, Primrose settled into life in Circleville. The school board enthusiastically approved her appointment as teacher, and she threw herself into preparing for the new term. The small schoolhouse became her domain, arranging desks, organizing books, planning lessons for the 28 students of varying ages who would be in her charge. She continued to stay with the Grahams, who had converted their storeroom into a proper bedroom for her and refused to accept more than a modest sum for room and board. "Having another woman around is payment enough," Martha insisted. "Besides, it's temporary until you establish yourself." The implied or marry Xander remained unspoken, but understood. For his part, Xander called on her regularly, riding into town twice a week without fail, sometimes bringing small gifts, wildflowers, a book of poetry, fresh peaches from a neighboring orchard, always treating her with a respect that made the town's other single ladies view her with undisguised envy. Their courtship progressed slowly but steadily. Dinners at the hotel became a regular occurrence. He escorted her to church on Sundays and to the occasional community gatherings, a barn raising, a harvest festival. He introduced her to more of the territory on weekend rides, showing her hidden valleys, spectacular vistas, and the small wonders of desert flora and fauna that she, with her Eastern upbringing, had never imagined. Through it all, they talked about their pasts, their dreams, their beliefs. They didn't always agree, which Primrose found refreshing. Xander respected her opinions even when they differed from his own, never dismissing her thoughts as many men might have done. The first day of school arrived in mid-September. Primrose stood nervously at the schoolhouse door, watching as children began to arrive, some on foot, others on horseback or in wagons with their parents. They eyed her curiously, these children of farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers, wondering what to make of their new teacher from the east. To her surprise, Xander appeared just before the bell was to ring, dismounting from his horse and approaching with a small wooden box in his hands. "Good morning, Miss Wade," he said formally, mindful of the watching parents and children. "I thought you might be able to use these." He opened the box to reveal a set of beautifully carved wooden letters and numbers. "For your younger students," he explained. "Pablo made them. His children learned their letters with something similar." Touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift, Primrose accepted the box. "Thank you, Mr. Zane." "They're perfect," he tipped his hat. "Good luck today, teacher," he said with a wink that only she could see. That small gesture of support gave Primrose the confidence she needed. She rang the bell, and as her students filed in, she knew she had found her calling. The weeks that followed were busy but fulfilling. Primrose discovered that teaching in a one-room schoolhouse required different skills than working with the privileged children of Philadelphia. Her students ranged from 6-year-old beginners to 16-year-olds completing their education before full-time work on family farms. Some were quick learners, others struggled with basics. All required her attention and patience. But she loved seeing the light of understanding dawn in a child's eyes, loved the community she was building within the schoolhouse walls, loved the sense of purpose each day brought. October arrived with crisp mornings and golden afternoons. The first frosts touched the hills around Circleville, and talk turned to the coming winter. Xander became busier with preparations at the ranch, securing enough hay for his cattle, repairing fences, ensuring his home was properly weatherized against the cold months ahead. Despite his increased workload, he still made time to see Primrose. One Sunday after church, as they walked together through town, he broached a subject that had been on both their minds. "Winter comes early in these mountains," he said, his breath visible in the cool air. "Another month and the passes might be difficult, if not impossible." Primrose nodded, understanding what he was really asking. It had been 3 months since she'd arrived in Circleville. The stage ran regularly now, but soon travel would become more challenging. If she intended to return east before spring, the time to decide was approaching. "I've been thinking about that," she admitted. "About my future here." Xander slowed his steps, his expression carefully neutral though tension was evident in the set of his shoulders. "And have you reached any conclusions?" They had stopped walking entirely now, standing beneath the bare branches of a maple tree at the edge of the town square. "I have," Primrose said, gathering her courage. "I've decided that I belong here, Xander, in Circleville. The school, the community, it feels right in a way nothing has before." Relief flooded his features, but he tempered it with caution. "I'm glad to hear it. The children adore you, and everyone I speak with sings your praises. There's more," she continued, heart pounding. "I've decided that I belong here, with you if that's still what you want." For a moment, Xander seemed unable to speak, his blue eyes searching her face as if to confirm he'd heard correctly. Then, heedless of their public location, he took her hands in his. "It is," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's all I've wanted since the day I cut those chains." With that reference to their unusual beginning, something shifted between them, acknowledgement of how far they'd come, from a bride delivered in chains to a woman choosing freely, from a lonely rancher to a man worthy of being chosen. "Then perhaps," Primrose suggested with a smile, "it's time for that proposal you mentioned wasn't yet forthcoming." Xander laughed, a sound of pure joy that turned heads among the churchgoers still milling about the square. Without hesitation, he knelt before her on one knee, still holding her hands in his. "Primrose Wade, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Not because of any contract or obligation, but because you choose me as I have chosen you." Tears pricked at Primrose's eyes as she nodded. "Yes, Xander Zane, I choose you, freely and with all my heart." He rose and, forgetting propriety entirely, pulled her into an embrace that lifted her feet from the ground. Their first kiss, witnessed by half the town, became the talk of Circleville for weeks to come, not for its impropriety, but for the undeniable love it represented. They were married 2 weeks later in Circleville's white clapboard church, with Sheriff Patterson giving the bride away and the entire town in attendance. Martha Graham wept openly, while Walter beamed with paternal pride. Even Eliza Abernathy, now heavily pregnant, attended with her husband, giving her official blessing to Primrose's permanent appointment as teacher. "You'll continue teaching, of course," Xander had insisted during their brief engagement. "It would be a waste of your talents and passion to do otherwise." So it was arranged that Primrose would ride to town with Xander 3 days a week for school, staying overnight with the Grahams when weather made daily travel impractical. It wasn't a conventional arrangement, but then, nothing about their union had been conventional from the start. Their wedding night found them alone at last at Zane's Crossing. Pablo and Maria had discreetly removed to their small cabin further down the creek, leaving the newlyweds to their privacy. A fire crackled in the hearth, warming the bedroom that Xander had built with such care and that Primrose would now share. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zane," Xander said softly, helping her remove the pins from her hair. "Home," Primrose repeated, savoring the word. "I don't think I truly understood what that meant until now." As her hair fell loose around her shoulders, Xander's hands stilled. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice serious. "You may have arrived here in chains, Primrose, but you've set me free. Free from loneliness, free from doubt, free to become the man I always hoped to be." Moved beyond words, Primrose turned to face him, reaching up to trace the beloved contours of his face. "And you, by cutting those chains, gave me the freedom to choose this life, to choose you with my whole heart." Their kiss sealed a promise made not through obligation or contract, but through love freely given and received. As the fire burned low and the first snow of winter began to fall outside, Xander and Primrose Zane began their life together, a life born from an unlikely beginning but destined for extraordinary happiness. The years that followed proved the truth of that destiny. Primrose continued teaching, becoming beloved by generations of Circleville children. Under her guidance, the small schoolhouse gained a reputation for excellence that drew families from surrounding areas. Xander's ranch prospered too. With Primrose by his side, he expanded his operations, breeding horses that became sought after throughout the territory. Zane's Crossing grew from a modest homestead to one of the most respected ranches in central Utah. Their family grew as well. In the spring of 1880, their son Thomas was born, followed 2 years later by their daughter Eleanor. Both children inherited their father's love of the land and their mother's thirst for knowledge, thriving in the unique blend of frontier self-reliance and educated refinement that characterized their home. The story of how they met became something of a legend in Circleville: the mail-order bride who arrived in chains, the cowboy who cut them off and declared her free, and the love that blossomed when choice replaced obligation. It was a story they shared with their children when they were old enough to understand, a testament to the power of freedom and the transformative nature of love freely given. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1903, surrounded by friends, children, and even grandchildren, Xander presented Primrose with a gift: a small silver charm in the shape of a broken chain. "To remember where we began," he said, "and how far we've come." Primrose, her beauty matured but undiminished by the years, fastened the charm around her neck. "I've never needed a reminder," she replied, her eyes still capable of making his heart race after all their years together. "But I'll treasure it all the same." That night, alone on the porch of the home they had built together, now expanded to accommodate their growing family, but still essentially the same house where they had begun their life together, they watched the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and crimson. "Any regrets?" Xander asked, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. Primrose considered the question, thinking back to the frightened young woman who had arrived in Circleville in chains, the tentative hope she had felt when a stranger cut them away, and all that had followed: the challenges and joys, the children and students, the life richer and more fulfilling than she could have imagined. "Not a single one," she said, squeezing his hand. "Every link in the chain that brought me to you was necessary, even the difficult ones." Xander raised their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her fingers, a gesture unchanged from their courtship days. "Then we are both truly free," he said. And so they were free to love, free to build, free to choose each other every day for the rest of their lives. The mail-order bride who had arrived in chains and the cowboy who had freed her had found in each other the truest liberty of all.